The western wind coming off the ridge carried the sharp, dry scent of pulverized limestone and dried alfalfa. It whipped across the lower paddock, rattling the loose corrugated tin on the loafing shed before dying out against the heavy timber of the main fence. I stood in the shadow of the barn, my boots planted in the dirt, watching the dust settle. That was my life. Dirt, steel, noise, and fixing things that other people broke. I preferred it that way. It was predictable. Steel makes sense. But there was absolutely nothing predictable about the woman standing on the loading ramp of the 4-horse aluminum transport trailer. A heavy wool saddle pad was draped carelessly over the white pasture fence behind her, soaking up the last of the golden hour sunlight. But nobody works a ranch in a fitted, dusty rose dress. The fabric clung to Madeline's shoulders, completely out of place against the backdrop of grazing horses, dry earth, and heavy machinery. She had come straight from town, straight from whatever bank or boardroom she had been fighting in all day. She stepped up onto the corrugated metal grating of the trailer deck. The heels of her boots rang hollow against the aluminum, a sharp metallic sound that cut through the wind. She stopped on the very edge of the ramp. Her silver hair caught the amber light as the wind pulled at it. She didn't turn completely around. Instead, she turned her upper body sideways, looking back down over her shoulder at me. "Can you see what's wrong from there?" she asked. The drop in my stomach had nothing to do with the setting sun, and everything to do with the severe, unnatural sag in the trailer's primary load-bearing hinge. I stood directly behind her on the dirt, the collar of my heavy denim jacket turned up against the sudden evening breeze. I shoved my bare hands deep into my jacket pockets, my knuckles brushing against the cold, familiar steel of a half-inch box wrench I'd forgotten was in there. I kept my hands buried. It was safer that way. The metal under her boots was letting out a high-pitched, agonizing groan. It was the sound of aluminum fatiguing under pressure, a structural failure happening in slow motion. "The shear pin is gone, and the main bracket is tearing straight through the aluminum sidewall," I said. My voice was flat. I didn't sugarcoat things. "If you put a 1,200-pound animal on that ramp tomorrow morning, the floor drops out. The horse breaks a leg and the trailer folds in half." Madeline released a very slow, very shaky exhale. I watched the breath leave her. She didn't step down from the compromised ramp. She just looked at the cracked weld, her shoulders sinking a fraction of an inch. It was the posture of a woman who had been holding a roof up with her bare hands for too long. "The buyer's transport driver arrives at exactly 6 a.m., she said. The fatigue in her voice was heavy, bleeding through the perfect, composed tone she usually maintained. "And their contractor made it clear in writing today. If the trailer isn't DOT compliant when they arrive to load the stallion, they void the sale entirely. They withhold the final payment." She finally stepped off the ramp, her boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. As she moved past me, the air shifted. Her arm brushed the sleeve of my denim jacket. A sudden, absolute stillness settled over the yard. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that physically blocks out the sound of the wind through the sycamore trees and the distant hum of the highway. I was just her son's friend. I was the guy who came around on weekends to weld broken gates because the city fabrication shops charged too much and took too long. But looking at the deep exhaustion lined around her eyes, the gap between our ages didn't feel like a boundary. It felt irrelevant. It felt like a job that needed doing. "Get away from the gate," I told her. I stepped forward, pulling my hands from my pockets. I ran a calloused thumb over the jagged tear in the aluminum, feeling the sharp, violent burrs of torn metal. The bracket wasn't just cracked, it was sheared. "Dean, it's Sunday night," Madeline said, her voice tight with panic she was trying desperately to hide. She stood a few feet away, her arms wrapping around her own ribs. "Every fabrication shop in the county is locked up. The supply yards are closed." "I'm not every shop," I said. I pulled a high-lumen tactical flashlight from my belt and clicked it on. The harsh white beam illuminated the structural ribbing beneath the chassis. The shadows jumped against the dirt. You have a 220-volt outlet in the lower barn? I need you to pull the truck up there. Now. I'm going to cut the rod out and rebuild the assembly. She hesitated. Her fingers found the simple silver ring on her right hand, twisting it in a slow, nervous circle. It was a micro-tell she only showed when she thought no one was paying attention. I was always paying attention. You don't have to sacrifice your Sunday night for your friend's mother, she said, her chin lifting stubbornly. I can try to renegotiate with them in the morning. I can ask for an extension. Steel doesn't care whose mother you are, I interrupted. The bluntness slipped out before I could catch it, but I didn't take it back. I wiped the rust dust on my jeans and looked at her. It's compromised. You can't negotiate with a broken hinge. Move the truck to the barn. 30 minutes later, the heavy industrial floodlights in the lower barn buzzed to life, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the cracked concrete floor. The air inside immediately smelled of old hay, diesel fumes, and the sharp metallic tang of an impending arc. I backed my work truck into the bay, the heavy diesel engine echoing off the high tin roof, and dropped the tailgate with a loud, ringing clang. I pulled the heavy canvas cover off my TIG welder. I checked the argon gas flow regulator, my fingers moving over the brass valves with practiced, mechanical precision. Madeline stood near the wooden workbench. The dusty rose dress was gone. She had changed into a thick, oversized flannel shirt and worn denim jeans, but the tension in her jaw remained exactly the same. She watched me drag the heavy, thick-gauge grounding cable across the concrete. The buyer is a corporate outfit out of Texas, she said, her voice competing with the low, steady hum of my generator kicking on. They've been looking for a reason to leverage the price down all week. This transport clause is a trap. If I don't deliver the horse onto their trailer at 6 in the morning, they walk away, and the bank takes the upper pasture by Friday. Then we close the trap, I said. I walked over to my toolboxes, the heavy drawers sliding open on oiled bearings. I pulled out a Makita angle grinder. Ear protection, I ordered, tossing her a pair of heavy yellow earmuffs from the passenger seat. She caught them, her eyes wide for a second before she nodded and slipped them over her ears. For the next 2 hours, the world reduced to nothing but sparks, deafening noise, and molten metal. I climbed under the rear of the trailer, the cold concrete seeping through the back of my work shirt. I fired up the angle grinder. It screamed as the abrasive disc bit into the damaged aluminum. A massive rooster tail of bright orange sparks bounced off my heavy leather jacket, illuminating the dark corners of the barn in violent flashes of light. I cut away the warped, ruined bracket, grinding the edges down to clean, bare metal. It took patience. You can't rush structural prep. When the rot was entirely gone, I climbed out and walked to the tailgate. I measured the gap with a set of steel calipers. I cut a piece of 1/4-inch steel plate, heavy enough to bridge the gap and reinforce the chassis rail permanently. I clamped the steel plate into position, tightening the C-clamps until the veins in my forearms stood out. I pulled my welding hood down, plunging my vision into absolute darkness. I struck the arc. The blinding blue-white light flared, isolating me in a tiny, intensely focused world of heat. I fed the filler rod into the puddle, weaving a tight, overlapping bead of metal. Precision wasn't just a habit. It was the only thing standing between Madeline and financial ruin. I watched the metal melt and fuse, a fluid dynamic of heat and steel that I understood better than I understood people. I dragged the puddle steadily, ensuring deep penetration into the base metal. I didn't think about the wind outside. I didn't think about the corporate buyers. I only thought about the tensile strength of the bond. When I flipped my hood up, the bead was flawless. It looked like a stack of silver dimes bonding the plate to the frame, radiating a dull, cherry-red heat that slowly faded to gray in the cool air of the barn. I stood up, rolling my shoulders to pop a kink out of my neck. I pulled my heavy leather gloves off and tossed them onto the tailgate. I turned around. Madeline was standing much closer than I expected. She had taken the earmuffs off and was holding a battered green thermos of coffee. She watched me with a quiet, grounding intensity, her eyes tracking the soot on my jaw and the sweat on my forehead. I took the thermos from her. Our fingers didn't touch, but the transfer of the warm metal from her hands to mine felt like an anchor dropping in rough water. The chaotic noise of the grinder and the welder was gone, replaced by the sudden, profound silence of the barn. It was a quiet room built just for us. "It's holding," I told her, unscrewing the cup and taking a bitter, scalding sip of black coffee. Before she could answer, before the tension in her shoulders could fully release, a pair of bright, aggressive headlights swept across the barn wall. Tires crunched loudly and fast onto the gravel driveway. A white fleet truck with a corporate logo plastered on the door pulled up, parking entirely too close to the barn entrance. Madeline's posture went rigid instantly. The tremor started in her hands again, rattling the empty cup she was holding. A man in a crisp polo shirt, holding a digital tablet and a clipboard, stepped out of the truck. He slammed the door and checked his watch. It was barely 9 p.m. "Ms. Gardner," the man called out, walking straight into the barn without waiting for an invitation. He didn't look at me. He didn't acknowledge the heavy machinery or the heat. His eyes swept over the trailer with a predatory gleam. "I'm the compliance inspector for the buyer. We decided to do the preload audit tonight to save time in the morning." He was looking for the broken ramp. He expected to find a failure. He had been sent to find one so they could kill the deal. I set the thermos down on the wooden workbench. The sudden silence in my head was absolute. I didn't feel angry. I felt perfectly, dangerously calibrated. I picked up a heavy, solid steel pry bar from my tailgate. It weighed 20 pounds. I carried it easily and walked over to the newly welded hinge. "Audit's done," I said. My voice carried no heat, only the heavy, immovable weight of a fact. The inspector stopped dead in his tracks, blinking in surprise as I approached the ramp. He finally looked at me, taking in the leather jacket, the soot, and the massive pry bar in my hands. "Excuse me. The contract clearly states the trailer must be structurally sound for a Class A load before transfer." "It is," I said. I wedged the flat, forged end of the steel pry bar directly under the heavy ramp and leaned my entire body weight onto it. The suspension of the trailer groaned loudly. The rear tires bulged slightly under the leveraged pressure, but the hinge didn't give a single millimeter. The weld was absolute. It was stone. "Tensile strength of a standard factory bracket is 30,000 psi, I told him, holding the pressure steady, my eyes locked on his. "This custom brace is rated for 70. It exceeds DOT compliance by double." The inspector frowned, his face flushing an angry red. He clicked his pen aggressively against his clipboard. "I need to see the certification for the modification. A backyard weld doesn't clear our corporate policy. Without a stamp, I void the load." "You're looking at the certifier," I replied. I let go of the pry bar. It clanged against the concrete with a deafening ring. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my federal welding credentials, holding them out so the harsh overhead light caught the official seal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Power doesn't need to shout. "The paperwork will be signed, stamped with my federal ID, and dated for 6 a.m. tomorrow. If you try to void the contract before the deadline, I'll personally testify to the State Transport Commission that you attempted a fraudulent breach of contract to manipulate a sale price." The inspector stared at the weld. He stared at my credentials. Finally, he looked at Madeline. The arrogant, dismissive set of his shoulders collapsed. He realized he had no leverage left. He had walked into a trap, and I had welded the door shut. "Fine," he muttered, his voice tight. He turned on his heel and walked rapidly back to his truck. We load at 6. When his taillights disappeared down the dark county road, the silence returned to the barn, thicker and heavier this time. Madeline leaned back against the wooden workbench, the adrenaline leaving her system in a sudden, visible rush. She closed her eyes, her head tilting back against the wood. I walked over to her. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, my fists clenched slightly to stop myself from reaching out. I didn't try to pull her into a hug. I reached past her, my arm a safe, respectful distance from her shoulder, and grabbed a Phillips head screwdriver from the bench. I tightened a loose screw on the tack room latch that had been rattling all night in the wind. I fixed the tiny, insignificant things she hadn't asked for because she was already carrying too much weight to worry about a rattling door. Madeline opened her eyes and watched me secure the latch. The fear was entirely gone from her face, replaced by a profound, heavy relief. "I thought I was going to lose the farm tonight, Dean," she whispered. The vulnerability in her voice was a raw nerve. "You're not losing anything tonight," I said, putting the screwdriver down. She stepped closer. The air between us lost the sharp chemical scent of ozone and settled into something warm, something resembling home. She reached out, her movements slow, and placed her hand flat against the heavy denim of my jacket right over my chest. It wasn't a desperate touch. It wasn't hungry or demanding. It was the physical transfer of stability. The tremor in her hand stopped completely the exact second she made contact. The chaotic noise of the world outside was physically blocked out. "I negotiate the final wire transfer tomorrow morning," she said, her voice steadying, drawing calm from the heavy fabric and the steady rhythm beneath it. "I'm not letting them dictate terms anymore." "You dictate the terms," I agreed. I didn't cover her hand with mine. I just stood perfectly still, a solid wall against the wind, letting her hold on for exactly as long as she needed. The next morning, the air was bitter cold. The sun broke over the eastern ridge, casting long, sharp shadows across the frost-covered pasture. The massive corporate transport rig arrived right on time at 6 a.m. The driver, a different, much older man from the inspector the night before, walked to the back. He inspected the ramp, ran a gloved hand over the flawless steel weld, nodded in professional approval, and loaded the stallion without a single issue. Madeline stood by the main fence, a clipboard in her hand. She had the buyer's regional manager on speakerphone. She looked entirely different in the daylight. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by sharp, absolute professional authority. "The load is secure," she said calmly into the phone, her shoulders squared against the morning wind. "The wire transfer clears into my account before the truck leaves my gate." "Those are the terms. Send the confirmation code now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by the rapid sound of typing. Then the manager agreed. Madeline looked at her phone screen, saw the banking alert pop up, and ended the call. She signed the driver's manifest and handed it back. She handled her own deal, standing entirely on her own 2 feet. I stood by my truck, finishing packing the heavy welding cables into the bed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from her son, my friend. "Hey man, Mom said you fixed the trailer last night. Thanks for helping her out. I owe you a beer." I read it, locked the screen, and slid the phone back into my pocket. Madeline walked across the gravel toward me. Her boots crunched loudly in the quiet morning. She stopped at the tailgate of my truck. She looked at the heavy machinery, the soot-stained canvas covers, and then up at me. "He thinks you're just doing a favor," she said quietly, referring to her son's text. "I don't do favors," I said. I closed the heavy steel tailgate with a solid metallic slam that echoed across the quiet, safe ranch. I turned to face her. "I do permanent fixes." She smiled. It was a real, unforced expression that reached her eyes and softened the sharp, tired lines of her face. She reached out, her fingers catching the edge of my jacket collar. She pulled me in. I didn't resist. I stepped forward, closing the distance. The kiss wasn't an exploration. It wasn't frantic, and it wasn't a question. It was an arrival. It was the heavy, grounding certainty of a steel lock clicking permanently into place. It was the exact moment the fighting stopped. The wandering was over. The void was closed. And the empty space was finally filled with something solid. Something that would hold. Closing thoughts. I learned that real strength isn't about carrying the weight of the world alone. It's about trusting someone enough to let them hold the tools when your hands are tired. Healthy love doesn't demand you shrink yourself to fit a role. It builds a foundation strong enough to hold you exactly as you are. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.